It's good to see you. Jess, thanks for those songs. That's freaking awesome. Um, just kind of want to see what's going on back there. Got Casios from the 80s and all kinds of goodness. Um, it was reminding me of that Diana de Prima poem I shared a couple months ago. The only war is the war against imagination. So you might just see a Casio keyboard, but other people see more. So what a good day to be with you. I was noticing little butterflies out here on the green roof. I was thinking there should be more green roofs in the world. Is that the right grammar? Yeah, although this week was giving me trouble, I wanted to do another week on kindness in the age of fear. And a lot of bad things are coming out in the news media, in our culture. A lot of intolerance and a lot of racism and sexism and misogyny and greed and lust, and mistrust and lies. So many lies, lies upon lies upon lies. And not a lot of kindness. At least I don't notice it too often. There's not a lot of kindness on Twitter. It's not sort of known for that, or anywhere else for that matter. And it kind of makes me feel a little crazy. Like, why would we be talking about kindness? Because there's a lot to be angry about, really, to tell you the truth, and disheartened. And those, I think, actually have a place. I could do a whole week, a whole month on anger, too. But why kindness? And the fact that was giving me trouble, I think, was reason to dig a little deeper. Maybe into my own posture toward all of the madness that's happening right now. And I also want to say, talking about kindness, as soon as at least I hear that word, I think about niceness. And I don't really think that's all that helpful. I mean, it's fine if you're nice. I mean, you can be nice to me after the service if you want. But that's not quite the same thing. Niceness is often just a sort of mask we wear so we don't have to tell the truth anyway. So kindness seems to seems to come from a different place. And in saying that, the reason why I'm saying that is because there are massive differences in worldview. There are actually worldviews that are colliding and clashing into one another, which is why our culture feels so insane. We have the unraveling and collapsing of major systems and major systems of thought. And that brings up a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of anger. But I want to say there are massive differences in worldview, and that has to be looked at. We can't just cover that up with sort of a cult of niceness. Like, oh, well, you believe what you want to believe, and I'll believe what I want to believe, and just leave it at that. No, there's more at stake than that. And we have to have these, I think, difficult conversations about worldview. It's absolutely the right time to talk about worldview. It's time to talk about prejudice and racism. It's time to talk about our history of violence in America toward the marginalized. It's time to talk about the myth of American exceptionalism in the world. It's time to talk about theology. I know everyone's favorite topic at C3. So much, believe it or not, is rooted in theology. So much of our, even our contemporary politics and decisions are rooted in theology. We have to look at that. It's time to talk about that other people in other shithole countries are just as important as your kids. That's a hard conversation to have. It really is. In other words, these are moral, ethical, and spiritual imperatives, in my opinion. These are moral, ethical, and spiritual imperatives to take a hard look at the worldview. Which, again, then why are we talking about kindness? How do we talk about these things? Is sort of question I'm asking myself. And I think it's a time for courage. Courage in the old sort of French sense of the word, of heart. It's a time for heart. Or I mentioned like 6 months ago, I love Margaret Wheatley's phrase that we need warriors for the human spirit. We need warriors for the human spirit. That courage, it's almost an age where we need warriors for courage. And that's a dangerous word, really. We think we don't need more warriors unless the weapons that they are carrying are different than weapons of mass destruction or weapons of mockery and belittling and us versus them sorts of things. So I might even change that to warriors of planetary consciousness. It sounds fancy, for one thing. But warriors of planetary consciousness, because what I mean is that a great consciousness is dawning. And whenever great shifts in worldview and consciousness dawn, it's not always guaranteed what that path will look like. And we do need warriors who are fighting for and working toward a greater awakening of not just a consciousness that includes all people, but it includes the entire planet. Why? Because the entire health of the planet depends upon it. So this is not like small time, let's just be nice to our neighbor and, water their lawn when they're in Florida. Of course, that doesn't really make sense in the winter. That'd be kind of mean, actually. So anyway, and let me say a few more things about this sort of shift in consciousness, because I think on my good days, all of the anxiety, pressure, fear, and craziness of contemporary culture, global culture, and American culture, I get disheartened. But on my good days, I see it as a great opportunity. Kind of in the old Greek sense of apocalypse. Apocalypse meant death. Well, it meant to reveal, but it was revealing the death of something and the resurrection of something else. And that's the case right now. And so in that sense, I think it's a great opportunity, that the pressure is creating a great opportunity. And I want to review a couple things about how I name that opportunity before we talk about kindness. So the dominant levels of consciousness that are operating in our world, we would call egocentric consciousness and ethnocentric consciousness. And if you're new to C3, we talked about these things. You can dig through our archives online if you want to. But egocentric consciousness and ethnocentric consciousness dominate the landscape, meaning either me, I, or us, ethnocentric consciousness. And when I say us, a pretty small version of us. My race, my gender, my tribe, my religious affiliation, my country, ethnocentric consciousness. And the invitation, the great pressures, like if we're being cooked inside of a cauldron, the pressure is toward an awakening of what we would call world-centric consciousness. That it's now the human race, not races. That's world-centric consciousness. There are no shithole countries. Even if there are shitty things that go on in all countries. That's world-centric consciousness, and maybe even bigger than that, ecocentric consciousness. And let's not just say, by saying those things, that's the consciousness we're in. That's the temptation. I'm in ecocentric consciousness. Yeah, right. Oftentimes I'm in egocentric consciousness. So it's not as simple as knowing what they are. It's much more like a slow dawning and awakening. And actually, believe it or not, things like laws and in civil society can grease the wheels of that awakening or block it. Like, I love the movement, by the way, just as a symbol in America, and it looks like it's going to happen in Grand Rapids, where they're taking dams down. That is an incredible symbol, because dams represent the human capacity to control the environment and the world, usually for human greed. And to remove them and to let the wild world flow as it is, that's a great symbol. But our laws and civil society can act like a dam. So that's why it matters if you vote and the kind of political engagements that you may or may not be involved in. That's why they matter. So I'm just trying to say it's a great opportunity for a larger shift in consciousness. So go ahead and engage and debate and be political and fight for the poor and for wetlands and wildlands, because in the end, it's not about us. It's about the vitality of the planet itself. And I know these are words, and words and actions have to hold hands. But right now, I'm up here giving words. So, yeah. So kindness, I'd like to say, is not about rolling over. Not about rolling over. I think it's actually much more like a quiver in one's bag that carries arrows. What would you call that? It's an arrow in the quiver. It's not a quiver in the quiver. It's an arrow in the quiver. I should think through these symbols before I say them. There's a great saying, maybe you've heard it. The samurai warrior says, the greatest war is the one that's not fought. But you know what else is true? They also have a sword. So there's a time for the sword. And maybe not sword in the old-fashioned sense, but there's a time when action is needed, and sometimes difficult action. And so kindness, I'd like to say, is an element of how we might move through the world. At least that's what I'm sort of mulling over. A couple more things, and then I want to look carefully at this Thomas Merton quotation. So our world right now is fueled by dualism, as you know. Dualism is the dividing up of the world. It's part of every human being's moral and psychological growing up. We begin to divide the world at a certain point between what's me and what's not me. That's the dualistic mind, as the Buddhists would call it. And it's needed. You can't avoid it. You can't be like, if I just put my kids in a progressive enough school, they wouldn't have a dualistic mind. It doesn't work that way. It's a psychological, it's something that develops psychologically. Categories. And right now, everything in our world is a category of us versus them. Black and white and Republican and Democrat. I mean, the fact that we just have two major political parties is funny. It's like dualism at its finest. You know, Israel, which is a total mess, has 32 political parties. So at least there are some choices. But anyway, this dividing up the world all the time, the dualistic mind is dominating our culture, and we get caught in it. I get caught in it all the time. But largely, I just think my side's right, which is that's the dualistic mind at work. So we just have to acknowledge that it captures something about our primal self. And we can't pretend that we too aren't caught up in all kinds of dualistic ways of being in the world and thinking. And part of what I wanted to say last week is that if we can see it inside, we can see our own capacities, sort of when we're dancing around love your neighbor as yourself, that your capacity to love your own being, your own self, is related to how you treat other people. Well, the same goes with this dualistic mind. If you can see your own tendency toward it, it doesn't have as much power. You don't then put it on everybody else out there. You say, yeah, we all get caught in this particular trap. So these were things that have been floating around in my mind this past week. And one of the cool things at C3 is that if you really want the full experience, there's the 9 a.m., there's the 10, and then there's the talk back. And at 9 a.m. we have the talk before, I guess we could call it. And we just host a conversation where everybody's voice is welcome, and I'm a listener along with everybody else. And last week somebody brought up the etymology of the word kindness. And I didn't believe him at first, so I got out my Google phone and looked it up. It's not like I didn't believe him, I thought, is that true? But inside the word, you can hear it, is the word kin. The etymology of the word itself is rooted in family, connection, kinship, belonging, To be kind is to extend or acknowledge or realize that there is a connection that is already present. That's what it is to be kind. To acknowledge a reality that you and I, or I and the other, are somehow family. That's not the same as being nice. And by the way, dealing with family is hard, if you haven't noticed. Even being kind to your kin, that's probably like the greatest task. I heard Eckhart Tolle say once, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family. You know, that'll take care of that. Just back to reality. So what I love about this, though, and this is maybe the big ask from ethnocentric consciousness to world-centric consciousness, how far does that kindness or kinship extend? Toward other people, toward other countries, toward other religions and races, toward other plants and animals. How far does it extend? And what might be practiced if we want that kind of connection to unfold? So in light of that, I thought of this Thomas Merton passage. I love Thomas Merton. In some ways, he changed my life. If you don't know who he is, what I say about him quickly, he was born in France. Really gifted academic and writer, and left that kind of scene for a Cistercian monastery. Cistercians are the ones that wear the white robes. And eventually found himself in, as a monk, but a monk in solitude. He had his own hermitage. And what's interesting about that, as an image, you think, well, this is someone who has totally unplugged from life and is just whatever, doing whatever monks do in their cell. Actually, his entire body of work was about engagement, about the most pressing social issues of the day. And writing and speaking into the culture from this place of hermitage. So he's a person of paradox in that respect. But anyway, enough of that. I thought about this passage, which I've always found to be quite moving. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness. He, by the way, was also a bridge between the East, meaning really Buddhism, and contemplative mystical Christianity. He started to connect these things in a way that no one had before. So this point of nothingness sounds a lot like Buddhism. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness which is untouched by sin and illusion. I know you probably don't like the word sin, but just take it at face value. Just whatever. Missing the mark is what it means. But is there a place in you untouched by that? By illusion? Man, that would be nice. A point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God. Or if you're uncomfortable with God language, to mystery. Which is never at our disposal. That's the ego's business. Like, now I'm going to claim my point of pure nothingness and put it on a tattoo, if you could even do that. The ego can't do anything about it, okay? From which God disposes our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. Now, first of all, that's a long sentence. Remember when people used to write like this? Anyway. Yeah. This little point of nothingness and absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. He's talking about the glory of being a human being. And he's about to extend that out beyond the point of his own pure nothingness. And we might want to ask, is that true? What is our view of human beings? And I'm not saying we all need to come together and create a doctrine statement of human beings. I just mean, when you sit down and think about it, how do you view other people? How do you view yourself, for that matter? Is there a spark inside people that is untouched by their own illusions, their own fantasies, their own brutalities? Oftentimes I think, well, not most people, but not all. It's challenging. He goes on. It is, so to speak, his name, this is the name of God, so to speak, written in us. As our poverty, as our indigence, is that how you say that word? Yes. As our dependence, as our sonship. You can forgive the somewhat sexist language here of the 1960s. Daughtership, we could add. And here's the metaphor I'm so drawn to. It is like a pure diamond, blazing with the invisible light of heaven. Is that true of human beings? Obviously not Republicans, but I'm kidding. I just needed a little moment of lightness there. It is in everybody. If we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light. You wonder where George Bush got that, you know? We would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. It's quite a statement. And then he has a little aside. I have no program for this seeing. In other words, I don't know how to tell you to go out and see this way. I have no program for this seeing. It is only given. It's like a gift. It comes out of the blue. But the gate of heaven is everywhere. This is a mystical vision of the world and a mystical vision of humanity. What Thomas Merton is expressing probably comes from an experience he writes in other places about on the streets of Louisville when he left the monastery. He was kind of a wild guy. He also had a girlfriend on the side, and he's the real deal. You gotta love a guy who lives in a monastery who has a girlfriend on the side. So, but he's in Louisville, and he has this moment where he looks out onto the street and falls in love with sort of everyone on the street. There's no program for achieving this. It just happens as a kind of gift. The heart gets cracked open. Thomas Merton would say by God, by mystery, by something. And you see, for a moment, this blazing, pure diamond in the soul of someone else, in the heart and soul of someone else. I'm just asking, is this true? Is this true of all humanity? I haven't had that many moments like this. I was trying to think about, have I ever experienced something like this? And I say maybe something like this. When I was, I used to live in Israel where I went to graduate school, and it was a time of great upheaval in my own personal worldview and faith, and also a time of great excitement when it came to academic studies. And I was walking home from class one day, and I was tired and it was hot, and I decided to stop in this little valley where there was a park and some green grass and some olive trees. And I sat down, and I didn't have anything in particular on my mind. And I looked up, and I saw in front of me a man, a Palestinian man, a Muslim, I think probably coming home from Friday prayers, asleep on the grass, on a bed of warm pita bread inside a plastic bag. Because when you get it from the market, it comes right out of the oven, they stick it in these plastic bags, and the plastic bag steams up. It's an amazing thing. But he's asleep on his own pita bread. And then up from just beyond him was a Jewish mother just holding the hands of her kids. And what would I say about this moment? It was a moment of a pure diamond, blazing with the invisible light of heaven. That'd be Thomas Merton's word. I don't know what words I would give toward it, but how can you have a Christian-ish person, whatever I was, and a Palestinian Muslim and a Jewish mother, Orthodox mother, all within 10 feet of one another, just going about life. Because you're tired sometimes, you just want to sleep on some warm pita, or you just want to walk with your kids in the park. And what I'm saying is, beneath all the categories of Jew and Gentile and Muslim and Jew and privileged and not privileged, what is beneath all that? Thomas Merton is saying something like a pure diamond that's blazing forth inside the beauty of every human being. And if we could but see this, he says, the darkness and cruelty of life would vanish. Yeah, and it did vanish for a moment. It did. So I have no program for this seeing. I didn't say, hey, 2 o'clock, I'm going to head on down to the park and, just sort of have a mystical vision of humanity. No, it doesn't work that way. Maybe it comes as a gift, but the question I think we can ask is, how might we offer a path of least resistance? And maybe that starts with a path of least resistance to the others in our lives. Because I have a lot of walls up. And you have a lot of walls up. And it's hard to see like this. It is. Let me give you something from the Buddha here that I think is related. Or actually, before I say something about the Buddha, let me just add one little quick thing to this. I think this entire passage from Thomas Merton is a pretty good summary of what the word namaste means, which is the God in me greets the God in you. That's what Merton is talking about. Something beneath the surface, the God in me sees the God in you. The pure diamond in me sees the pure diamond in you. The point of pure nothingness, which my ego has no control of, greets the point of pure nothingness, which your ego has no control of. I'm going to tweet that in a minute. It will make sense to no one. So, and the Buddha gives some instructions, and I love this here. He says, we will develop and cultivate the liberation of mind by loving kindness. I think he's speaking about dualism here, the dualistic mind, the mind of division. So he says, we will develop and cultivate the liberation from our own dualistic mind by loving kindness, which has to be practiced. So the kind of sight that Thomas Merton is talking about, there's no program for that. However, you can practice loving kindness, kinship, little tiny moments of extending grace. Does that mean you have no sword? No. You are like a samurai warrior that has a sword, and the sword often has to say painful things, or I should say difficult things. But that doesn't mean it can't be done in the spirit of loving kindness as a practice, which probably is going to be way difficult if we keep it in the abstract realm of politics. How would you do that? It becomes much more everyday and pressing when we're just talking about the people in our ordinary lives. As the terrain that we are invited to wander around in. So we will develop and cultivate the liberation from our own dualism by loving kindness, by acting and behaving this way. Make it our vehicle, make it our basis, stabilize it, exercise ourselves in it, and fully perfect it. It's like, if I want to, it's a simple sports metaphor, so I'm sorry, but if you want to run a marathon, you can't just do it. Well, you could, but you'd be in the hospital. You have to exercise, and the exercise matters, and it's like flexing a muscle, and loving kindness is like flexing a muscle, a psycho-spiritual muscle. And I know you can do it because you treat your kids that way sometimes, but you can do it, and as you flex that muscle, suddenly the realms of kinship begin to expand. So I think I might say that kindness in practice like this lowers the gloves of the ego in me and in other people. It does. If someone treats me kindly, even if I really don't like what they stand for, suddenly my ego doesn't know what to do. You know, just the gloves come down a little bit. You know, not the gloves come off, but I just same with any act of loving kindness. Even when you're standing up for things that are really difficult and not very culturally welcome. If the arrow comes out of the quiver and there's a little loving kindness in there, our ego defenses, meaning our dualistic mind, takes a back seat. And that greases the wheels of something much bigger, which is the dawning of a more world-centric and egocentric consciousness. You can have a role in that in your everyday interactions, is my intuition. So I guess what I'm saying, I guess this is, if this is as close to a prayer as I might come to, here's my hope, that we have a taste of this poverty and nothingness that Merton's talking about, which is the glory of our sameness. May we have a taste of that in our own lives, and I think as we look out toward the others, this pure diamond of the human soul, we might say. And here's another hope I have, or kind of prayer. May we find ways of being kind. In a culture where actually kindness is mocked now. It's become so bitter that someone who does something kind is called naive. So may we find ways of doing that, practicing with our neighbors and friends, flexing that muscle. And I want to say one other thing, and maybe practice this kindness as an act of fierce resistance, because I don't think, like I said before, this is a time where we just roll over. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a kind of fierce and ancient resistance toward so much suffering, evil, bigotry, racism, and hatred, but not meeting that in kind, but meeting that with kindness. So, in light of that, I'm going to give you a chance to practice. As Jess comes up and plays another magic song and a magic Casio, here's the invitation. I'd like you to stand up, because if you can't do it here, you can't do it anywhere, and greet one another with this ancient expression that means God in me greets a God in you. So let's end this little talk with some namaste.